The Weeping House, a complete story. The morning Mrs. Edith Hartwell knocked on my door, I was 73 years old and convinced I'd seen everything life had to offer. I was wrong. She stood on my porch in her floral housecoat, her steel gray hair twisted into curlers, clutching a casserole dish like a shield. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval that seemed to have been drawn there with a ruler. "Dr. Monroe," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about the child." I blinked at her through my bifocals, my arthritic fingers still wrapped around my morning coffee mug. "Child? What child?" "The one crying in your house every night." She thrust the casserole forward as if it were evidence in a trial. "I brought you a tuna noodle casserole 3 weeks ago, and I've heard it every night since. The poor thing sounds absolutely heartbroken." I stepped back, genuinely confused. "Edith, I live alone. I have for 15 years since Margaret passed. You know that." Her eyes narrowed. "Dr. Monroe, I know what I hear. Every night around 2 in the morning, a child crying, sobbing, really. It goes on for hours." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Are you keeping someone's grandchild against their will?" The accusation was so absurd I actually laughed, which was precisely the wrong response. Edith's face flushed red, and she turned on her heel, marching back across the lawn to her own house. I watched her go, shaking my head, and closed the door. But the seed was planted. That night I lay in bed, my 40-year-old house settling around me with its familiar creaks and groans. The radiator hissed. The ancient oak tree outside scratched its branches against the siding. Normal sounds, expected sounds. And then, at 2:17 a.m., according to the glowing numbers on my bedside clock, I heard it. A child crying. It was faint, muffled, as if coming from behind walls or beneath floors. The sound was heartbreaking, not the angry wail of a tantrum, but the deep, gulping sobs of genuine despair. I sat up so fast my back protested with a sharp pain. "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse with sleep. "Is someone there?" The crying continued, unchanging in pitch or intensity. I grabbed my robe and my old baseball bat, a Louisville Slugger I'd kept since my minor league days 50 years ago, and made my way through the house. I checked every room. The 2 spare bedrooms that had once belonged to my children, now grown and living in different states. The bathroom, the closets, the basement with its cobwebs and mothball smell. The attic, accessed by a creaking pull-down ladder. Nothing. But the crying continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time I gave up searching, my hands were trembling. I returned to bed but didn't sleep. At 5:43 a.m., the crying stopped as abruptly as it had begun, as if someone had flipped a switch. I sat there in the growing light of dawn, wondering if Edith was right to worry about me. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe this was the beginning of dementia, auditory hallucinations brought on by loneliness and age. But it had sounded so real. The next night, I prepared. I set up my old camcorder, a relic from the 1990s when I used to film my children's school plays, and positioned it in the hallway. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter with a voice recording app running. I even dug out Margaret's old baby monitor from a box in the attic and set it up in the living room. At 2:17 a.m., the crying began again. I watched the camcorder's display screen, nothing visible, just the empty hallway lit by a nightlight, but the sound was there, clear as day through the camcorder's speaker. I checked my phone. The recording app showed sound waves spiking with each sob. The baby monitor crackled with the crying, distorted slightly by the old electronics. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head. I spent the next 3 hours moving through my house with the camcorder, filming every room, every corner, every shadow. The crying never stopped, never changed. It was constant, relentless, heartbreaking. At 5:43 a.m., it stopped. I played back the recordings. The crying was there on all of them, but there was never any visual evidence of a child. Just sound. Just endless, desperate sobbing. Dr. Augustus Gus Reeves arrived at my house 3 days later, carrying a leather satchel that looked older than both of us combined. Gus had been my colleague back when I was still practicing internal medicine, before retirement had claimed us both. He'd always been eccentric, the kind of man who read Latin for fun and collected antique medical instruments. When I'd called him about the crying, he'd listened without judgment and agreed to come. "So," he said, settling into my reading chair with a cup of Earl Grey tea, "you're being haunted." I didn't say haunted. I said I'm hearing crying. Every night at the same time, a child that doesn't exist, in a house where no child lives. He raised one bushy white eyebrow. "What would you call it?" I didn't have an answer. Instead, I showed him the recordings. We sat together watching the grainy camcorder footage, listening to the desperate sobs echoing through empty rooms. Gus was quiet for a long time after the recordings ended. Finally, he set down his teacup with a soft clink. "I need to tell you something, Richard, something I've never told anyone." He looked at me with unusual seriousness. 20 years ago, just after my wife died, I heard her voice. Every night for 3 months, I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and hear Alina calling my name from the garden. I thought I was going mad. "What happened?" "I investigated. I'm a scientist, even if I'm a retired one. I set up recordings just like you did, and her voice was there, captured on tape. Eventually, I spoke to her, out loud in the garden at 3 a.m. like a crazy person, and she answered." I stared at him. "Gus, why didn't you ever?" "Because I'm a rational man, Richard. Because I've spent my entire life believing in empirical evidence and reproducible results. Because accepting that I spoke with my dead wife's spirit would mean questioning everything I thought I knew about reality." He leaned forward. "But I did speak with her. And after I helped her with what she needed, selling her grandmother's ring that I'd kept in a drawer, donating it to her favorite charity, she stopped calling. And I never heard her voice again." The story hung in the air between us. Finally, I asked, "Do you regret it, helping her move on?" "Every day," Gus said softly. "But she was in pain, Richard. She couldn't rest. What kind of man would I be if I'd ignored that just to keep hearing her voice?" We sat in silence for a while, two old men contemplating mysteries we weren't equipped to understand. "So what do?" I finally asked. "We investigate properly. We find out who this child is and what they need, and then we help them." Gus pulled out his phone. "I know someone who might be able to assist. Her name is Dr. Patricia Eames. She's a grief counselor, but she also studies, let's call them unexplained auditory phenomena. She's helped several people in situations similar to yours." "You mean she believes in ghosts?" "I mean she believes in helping people, living or dead. There's a difference." Gus made the call. Dr. Eames could visit in 2 days. That night, something changed. The crying began at 2:17 a.m. as usual. But this time, I didn't grab my camcorder or check my recordings. Instead, I sat up in bed and spoke directly to the empty room. "I hear you," I said. "I don't know who you are, but I hear you, and I want to help." The crying paused, just for a moment, just for a few seconds. Then it resumed, but there was something different about it. A quality I couldn't quite identify, almost like relief. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my bed, listening, occasionally speaking words of comfort into the darkness. I felt foolish, but I also felt like it was the right thing to do. At 5:43 a.m., when the crying stopped, I could have sworn I heard a small voice whisper, "Thank you." Dr. Patricia Eames was not what I expected. I'd pictured some New Age mystic with flowing scarves and crystal pendants. Instead, she was a practical woman in her 50s wearing sensible shoes and a cardigan, carrying a briefcase that could have belonged to any accountant. "Dr. Monroe," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Thank you for allowing me into your home. Gus has told me about your situation." I'm not sure situation is quite the right word. She smiled. "You're being haunted by the sound of a crying child. What would you call it?" "Perplexing." "That works too." We sat in my kitchen, me, Gus, and Dr. Eames, and I walked her through everything. The recordings, the consistent timing, the lack of any visual evidence. The way the crying seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dr. Eames took notes in a leather journal, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she closed her journal and looked at me thoughtfully. "I've encountered 17 similar cases over the past 12 years, she said. Auditory phenomena with consistent patterns, usually associated with locations rather than people. In 14 of those cases, we were able to identify the source and help resolve the situation. And the other 3? Still ongoing, but the people involved have learned to coexist with their residents. You're talking about this very casually. Because I've seen it enough to know it's real, Dr. Monroe. I don't claim to understand the physics or metaphysics of it. I'm not a parapsychologist. I'm a grief counselor who happens to specialize in unusual cases. What I do know is that consciousness, trauma, and place can become entangled in ways we don't fully understand. And sometimes, people like you can hear those entanglements." "Why me?" She shrugged. "That's the question, isn't it? In my experience, people who hear these things usually have several things in common. They're often older, they've usually experienced significant loss, they're living alone, and they have a certain openness. Not necessarily a belief in the supernatural, but a willingness to listen without immediately dismissing. That describes half the retirees in America." "Perhaps, but you're the one hearing a child cry. That suggests something specific about you or your home." Dr. Eames pulled out what looked like a modified stethoscope connected to a small electronic device. "This is an amplified directional microphone. If the crying has a specific source point, this should help us locate it." That night, the 3 of us waited in my living room like a geriatric ghost hunting team. Dr. Eames had set up additional recording equipment, along with several thermometers placed around the house to detect temperature changes. "A classic sign of paranormal activity," she explained. At 2:17 a.m., the crying began. Dr. Eames immediately went to work with her directional microphone, moving slowly through the house while watching the readings on her device. Gus followed with a tablet displaying the temperature readings from the various sensors. "The sound is coming from below," Dr. Eames announced after 20 minutes of careful measurement. "Specifically from beneath the foundation. The acoustic properties suggest a confined space, possibly underground." "There's nothing under my house except foundation and dirt," I said. "Are you certain? What about a crawl space, a basement, an old utility access?" "I have a basement, but the crying doesn't seem louder there. If anything, it seems quieter when I go down." Dr. Eames frowned, taking more readings. "That's unusual. The sound should intensify as you get closer to the source." "Unless the source is trying to reach the living space above," Gus suggested. "If this is a spirit, maybe they're calling up toward where people would be, not down toward where they are." We spent 3 hours mapping the sound throughout the house. Dr. Eames created a detailed acoustic profile, measuring the crying's volume and clarity in every room. When the crying stopped at 5:43 a.m., she spread her notes across my kitchen table and studied them carefully. "The epicenter is definitely beneath your house, somewhere near the center of your foundation. But the pattern is strange. It's as if the sound is trying to escape from underground, pushing upward through the structure." "What does that mean?" "It means whoever this is, they're trapped below. Or at least, that's where their strongest connection to this world exists." She looked at me seriously. "Dr. Monroe, I think we need to find out what's under your house. Not just foundation and dirt. Something specific. Something with a history." The Millbrook Public Library smelled of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. The local history section was tucked into a corner on the 2nd floor, overseen by a stern librarian named Mrs. Cho who looked like she'd been born between the stacks. "Property records," she repeated, peering at us over reading glasses that dangled from a beaded chain. "What's the address?" I told her. She disappeared into a back room and returned 15 minutes later with a stack of leather-bound volumes and several rolled maps. "Your property is in the old Whistler Farm tract," she said, spreading a map from 1952 across a reading table. "The farm was subdivided in the early 1980s for residential development." Gus, Dr. Eames, and I leaned over the map. My house sat where fields had once been, about half a mile from the old farmhouse itself. What happened to the farm? Dr. Eames asked. Mrs. Cho pulled out a thick book labeled Millbrook Historical Society, 20th Century. She flipped through pages until she found what she was looking for. The Whistler farm was established in 1847 by Dutch immigrants, she read. It remained in the Whistler family for 4 generations. In 1952, the farm was abandoned after. She paused, her finger tracing the text. After a tragedy involving the family's youngest child. My stomach clenched. What kind of tragedy? She looked up at us, her expression grave. The child disappeared, 7-year-old Emma Whistler. She vanished from the farm on October 12, 1952, and was never found. The family searched for months. The entire town searched. Police, volunteers, search parties combing every inch of the property. They never found her, Dr. Eames asked. Not a trace. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. The family couldn't bear to stay after that. They sold the land and moved away. The farmhouse stood empty for years before the property was finally sold for development in 1982. Gus and I exchanged looks. A missing child, never found, on the property where my house now stood. Where exactly did she disappear from? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mrs. Cho consulted the book again. The fields behind the farmhouse. The article says she was playing near an old well that had been covered over years earlier. Some thought she might have fallen in, but when they dug it up, they found nothing. The well had been properly sealed. Sealed or filled in? Dr. Eames asked sharply. Mrs. Cho looked at the text again. It says, the well had been covered with boards and the opening secured, but I don't see any mention of it being filled with earth. So there could have been an open shaft beneath the boards, Gus said slowly. Possibly, but they checked it. The article says they investigated the well thoroughly. Do you have more detailed property maps? Dr. Eames asked. Ones that show where structures used to be, specifically wells, cisterns, any kind of underground features. Mrs. Cho did. 20 minutes later, we stood looking at a 1950 survey map with a sick feeling growing in my stomach. According to the map, an abandoned well had sat almost exactly where my house's foundation was now located. They said they checked it, I said weakly. In 1952, Gus pointed out, before your house was built, before the area was excavated and graded for development, what if? He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood. What if they hadn't checked carefully enough? What if a frightened 7-year-old girl had fallen through rotted boards into a deep well, and in the darkness and confusion, the search parties had missed her? What if she'd been down there all along, waiting for someone to find her? What if she was still waiting? We need to contact the police, Dr. Eames said firmly. If there's any chance there are human remains on your property, they need to investigate. I nodded numbly, staring at the map. The well had been right there, right beneath where my living room was now, where I'd heard the crying every night for weeks. Emma Whistler had been 7 years old, the same age her crying sounded. October 12, 1952, 71 years ago. 71 years of waiting in the dark. Officer Janet Reeves sat in my kitchen with a coffee cup and a deeply skeptical expression. She was in her 40s, efficient, and clearly thought we were wasting her time. Let me understand this correctly, she said. You want to dig up your basement floor because you hear a ghost crying, and you think it's a child who went missing 70 years ago. Not just any child, Dr. Eames interjected. Emma Whistler. There are documented records of her disappearance from this property. The case was never solved. And you think she's been, what, haunting this house? We think her remains might be beneath the foundation, Gus said. Specifically, we believe she may have fallen into an old well that was on this property. A well that was never properly searched or filled in before the land was developed. Officer Reeves sighed and pulled out her phone. She made several calls, speaking in low tones. I heard phrases like historical cold case and possible remains, and yes, I know how it sounds. Finally, she turned back to us. I spoke with my captain and checked the missing persons database. Emma Whistler is listed as a cold case. Disappeared October 12, 1952. Never resolved. Because of the age of the case and the historical significance, the captain is willing to authorize a preliminary investigation. So you'll help? I asked. I'm calling in a ground-penetrating radar team. If there's an old well or any significant underground void beneath your house, they'll find it. But Dr. Monroe, I need to be clear. This is a substantial undertaking. If the radar shows nothing, that's the end of it. We're not tearing up your foundation on the basis of unexplained sounds. I understand. She softened slightly. I will say this, I looked up the Emma Whistler case after Gus called. It was huge news at the time. The whole town searched for months. Her parents never recovered. If there's any chance we can bring closure to that family, even after all these years, it's worth investigating. The ground-penetrating radar team arrived the next afternoon. They consisted of 2 technicians, David Chen, a young man who looked barely out of college, and Maria Santos, a woman in her 30s with the confident air of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. GPR can detect variations in soil density, voids, metal objects, and potentially organic materials down to about 30 feet, Maria explained as they unloaded equipment from their van. If there's an old well under your house, we'll find it. They spent 4 hours methodically scanning my basement floor, pushing the radar equipment back and forth in a grid pattern while David monitored readouts on a laptop. We waited upstairs, me, Gus, Dr. Eames, and Officer Reeves. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I kept thinking about Emma Whistler. What had she been like? What had her last moments been like, falling into darkness, calling for help that never came? Got something, David called up the basement stairs. We all rushed down. The technicians had marked a large circle on my basement floor with chalk. There's definitely a void here, Maria said, pointing to the laptop screen showing colorful layers of subsurface material. Approximately 8 feet deep, cylindrical shape, about 4 feet in diameter at the top. It's been partially filled with loose material, probably dirt and rubble, but there's still a significant void space at the bottom. Could it be a well? Officer Reeves asked. The dimensions are consistent with a hand-dug well from the late 1800s or early 1900s. And look here. She pointed to some anomalies in the scan. These darker areas at the bottom could be water, or they could be organic material that's broken down over time. Officer Reeves took a deep breath. Organic material like a human body, yes. The room fell silent. We all stared at the chalk circle on the basement floor. What do we do now? I asked quietly. Now we excavate, Officer Reeves said. I'll need to call in forensics and get approval for a full investigation. This is officially a potential crime scene. It's not a crime scene, Dr. Eames said softly. It's a grave, an accidental grave for a little girl who's been waiting 71 years to be found. That night, the crying was different. It started at 2:17 a.m. as always, but this time between the sobs there were words, faint but unmistakable. Help me, please. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Emma, I called out. Emma Whistler. The crying stopped instantly. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive. I could hear my own heartbeat, the clock on the wall, the wind outside. Then, from directly beside my bed, so close I felt the breath of it. You know my name. I turned on the lamp with shaking hands. Nothing, no one, but the voice had been real. We found you, Emma. We know where you are. We're going to bring you home. Home? The voice sounded so small, so young, so hopeful. Can I go home to Mama? My throat tightened with emotion. Your Mama isn't. Emma, it's been a long time, but we're going to take you out of the dark. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened to you. We're going to give you a proper rest. I fell, she said, and now the voice was moving around the room as if she was packing. The boards broke. I fell down, down, down. I called for Mama and Papa, but nobody came. I called and called until my voice was gone. The water was so cold. I couldn't climb out. The walls were too slippery. Oh, Emma, I'm so sorry. It was dark for so long, days and days and days. I got so tired. I just wanted my mama to sing to me. She always sang to me when I was scared. I felt tears running down my face. What did she sing? Emma's voice, when it came, was melody without words. A lullaby hummed in the darkness by a child who'd been alone and afraid for 7 decades. I found myself humming along, though I didn't know the tune. It seemed like the right thing to do. When the melody ended, Emma's voice was calmer. You'll really find me. You'll bring me up from the dark. I promise. Will you tell Mama I'm sorry? I wasn't supposed to play near the well. She told me not to. I was bad. Oh, sweetheart, no. It wasn't your fault. It was an accident. Your mama never blamed you. Will you tell her anyway? I will, I promise. The presence in the room faded. The oppressive silence lifted. I sat in my bed until dawn, humming that lullaby I didn't know, thinking about a little girl who'd waited in the dark for longer than I'd been alive. The excavation crew arrived at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. A team of 4 workers with jackhammers and shovels, accompanied by Officer Reeves, a forensics photographer, and Dr. Sarah Vance, the county medical examiner. Dr. Vance was a brisk woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a manner that suggested she'd seen everything. She shook my hand firmly. Dr. Monroe, I understand this has been quite an ordeal for you. More so for Emma Whistler, I think. She nodded approvingly. Let's see if we can finally bring her home. The sound of jackhammers breaking through concrete was deafening. I retreated upstairs with Gus and Dr. Eames, unable to watch but unable to leave. Are you all right? Dr. Eames asked gently. I spoke with her last night, with Emma. She asked me to tell her mother she was sorry. Gus reached over and squeezed my shoulder. You gave her something no one else could. You listened. You heard her when no one else did for 70 years. Her mother is dead, Gus. Everyone she knew is probably dead. What kind of closure is that? The kind that lets her rest, Dr. Eames said. She's been caught between worlds, Richard. Unable to move on because no one knew where she was, because her body was never laid to rest, because the story was never finished. You're finishing it. It took 6 hours to break through the concrete foundation and begin carefully excavating the earth below. Around 2 p.m., the foreman, a man named Earl with forearms like tree trunks, called up the basement stairs. Dr. Monroe, you need to see this. We descended into the basement. A ragged hole had been opened in the floor, surrounded by broken concrete and disturbed earth. And there, about 5 feet down, was a circle of old brick, the rim of a well. It's real, Officer Reeves breathed. The workers had uncovered the top of the well shaft. It was about 4 feet in diameter, constructed from handmade bricks that crumbled at the touch. The shaft descended into darkness below. We're going to excavate by hand from here, Dr. Vance said, pulling on examination gloves. If there are remains down there, I don't want them disturbed any more than necessary. The next phase was painstaking. Dr. Vance and her team descended into the excavation with hand tools, carefully removing the filled dirt that had been dumped into the well, probably during construction, decades after Emma disappeared. I watched from the basement stairs as they worked. Every shovelful of dirt felt like it carried weight, like we were peeling back layers of time and tragedy. At 4:47 p.m., Dr. Vance stopped digging and looked up with a pale face. Officer Reeves, I found something. We all crowded around the excavation. Dr. Vance had cleared away dirt to reveal something white, bone. Small bone, a child's bone. Everyone out except essential personnel, Officer Reeves ordered. This is now an active forensic investigation. But before we left, Dr. Vance carefully brushed away more dirt. Lying next to the bones, incredibly preserved by the conditions in the well, was a decomposed rag doll with a faded blue dress. Next to it, a tarnished metal lunch pail with Emma, painted on the side in chipped letters. I had to sit down on the basement stairs. My legs wouldn't hold me. It's her, I said. It's really her. She's been here all along. Gus sat beside me, and we waited while the forensics team documented everything. The photography, the measurements, the careful excavation of remains that had lain in darkness since Eisenhower was president. That night, the crying didn't come at 2:17 a.m. For the first time in weeks, my house was silent. Dr. Sarah Vance called me 2 weeks later and asked me to come to her office at the county medical examiner's facility. Gus drove me there, neither of us saying much during the 30-minute trip. Dr. Vance's office was neat and professional, with diplomas on the walls and a faint smell of antiseptic. She gestured for us to sit and pulled up files on her computer. The bones are consistent with a female child, approximately 7 years old, she told us, her voice gentle. The skeletal development, the fusion of growth plates, and the dentition all match. The remains have been in that well for approximately 70 years, give or take a few years. The brick well shaft protected them from animals and most weathering. Could it be Emma Whistler? I asked. I tracked down her medical records through the state archives. They keep old records digitized now. Emma broke her right arm when she was 5 years old. She fell off a horse. The x-rays from her treatment were kept on file at the old Millbrook Hospital. Dr. Vance pulled up 2 images side by side on her screen. One was a yellowed x-ray from 1950. The other was a fresh x-ray of the bones found in my basement. Look at the radius bone in the right forearm. See this slight malformation where it thickened during healing? That's from a greenstick fracture that healed without perfect alignment, very common in children. Both x-rays show the exact same malformation in the exact same location. So it's her. I'll need DNA confirmation from living relatives for absolute certainty, but yes, I'm confident these are Emma Whistler's remains. We also found textile fibers consistent with a cotton dress, blue, which matches witness descriptions of what Emma was wearing the day she disappeared. The doll and lunch pail corroborate the identification. I slumped in my chair, feeling a mixture of grief and relief. She's been there all along, right under my house, for 7 decades. The well was covered with boards, according to the historical accounts, Dr. Vance said. My theory is that Emma was playing near the well. The old boards rotted through, and she fell. The well was about 30 feet deep. She would have fallen all the way to the bottom, into standing water that collected there. The search parties that investigated the well in 1952 probably just looked down from the top with flashlights. In the darkness, with debris and shadows, they missed her. How long would she have survived? Gus asked quietly. Dr. Vance hesitated. Based on the evidence, probably several days, long enough to hope for rescue, long enough to be terrified. The room was quiet for a long moment. There's something else, Dr. Vance said. She opened a drawer and pulled out an evidence bag. Inside was a piece of paper, protected by archival sleeves, yellowed and water-stained but still legible. We found this in the lunch pail. It's a note. She laid it on the desk. In a child's careful handwriting, it read, Dear Mama and Papa, I am sorry I was bad. I am in the well. I cannot get out. It is very dark. Please come find me. I will be good. I promise. I love you, Emma. I felt tears rolling down my face. This poor child, alone in the dark, writing a note in case someone found her lunch pail, still hopping to be rescued, still trying to be good. She tried to leave a message, I said. She was so smart, so brave. Yes, she was, Dr. Vance agreed. And now, 70 years later, someone finally heard her. Officer Reeves joined us for the rest of the meeting. She brought news about the investigation. The case is being closed as an accidental death, she said. No evidence of foul play, just a tragic accident that was missed by the original investigation. The district attorney agrees there's no criminal liability for the property developers who built over the well. They had no way of knowing there were remains there. What happens now? I asked. Now we find Emma's family and return her to them. Or, Officer Reeves paused, if there are no living relatives who want to claim her, the county will provide a proper burial. She won't be forgotten again. Finding living relatives of Emma Whistler proved more difficult than expected. Her parents, John and Martha Whistler, had died in the 1970s, both of broken hearts, according to the obituaries I found. John had died first in 1971, and Martha followed less than a year later. Neither had ever stopped searching for their daughter. Emma's older brother, Peter, had died in Vietnam in 1968, killed in action at age 24. He'd never married, never had children. He'd enlisted at 18, 6 years after his sister vanished, and according to letters archived at the local historical society, he'd told friends he was tired of searching for ghosts. The Whistler line seemed to have ended in tragedy. But then Gus, doing genealogical research that would have impressed any ancestry detective, found a connection. Peter Whistler had a half-sister, born to John Whistler from a previous marriage that had ended before he met Martha. Her name was Helen Crane, and she'd moved to California in 1955, 3 years after Emma disappeared. Helen had died in 2003, but she'd had 3 children. One of them, Catherine Burke, was still alive. I called the number Officer Reeves had provided, my hands sweating as I dialed. "Mrs. Burke,